In this video, we're going to define the inverse cosine function. Now, if we graph y equals cosine x, which has a domain of all reals and a range of -1 to 1, inclusive of the endpoints, then we can note that the function fails the horizontal line test and therefore is not 1 to 1. So, to define the inverse cosine function, we need to restrict the domain of the cosine function to be 0 to pi inclusive. Now, this segment of the cosine function will be 1 to 1. There are other restrictions that make the cosine function 1 to 1, but this one used here is the universally accepted restriction. And now that we have a restricted version of the function y equals cosine x that is 1 to 1, the domain is 0 to pi inclusive of the endpoints and the range is -1 to 1 inclusive, then we can define the inverse cosine function to be y equals inverse cosine of x if and only if x equals cosine y. And we interchange domain and range, and thus the domain of inverse cosine function is -1 to 1 inclusive, and the range is 0 to pi inclusive. We can take the restricted version of the graph of y equals cosine x and reflect it over the line y equals x in order to obtain the graph of the inverse cosine function. Now, on the image we have here, in red, we have the graph of y equals cosine x over the domain of 0 to pi inclusive. And we also have on the same coordinate grid in blue the graph of y equals inverse cosine of x over the domain -1 to 1 inclusive. A few notes to make here. There are two ways that we can denote the inverse cosine function. One way is to use arc cosine, and we spell that ARCCOS. The second way to write the name of the function for inverse cosine is to use a superscript of -1 on the name of the cosine function. So in other words, we write the letters COS, then we have a superscript of -1. And we always want to be careful here because when we're using a superscript of -1, this is not interpreted as an exponent. So in other words, inverse cosine of x does not equal 1 over cosine of x. And then lastly, most calculators have the capability of calculating values for inverse trigonometric function. And in most cases, the inverse trigonometric functions are on the same key located above its respective trigonometric function.